basically they have better interactions between the part of their brains that process sound and the parts of their brains that execute movements. Because when you play an instrument, you have exquisite motor control, and at the same time, you have a very finely developed ear. As people say, it's the ear, but of course it's not the ear, it's the brain.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 159th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is kind of a listener request episode, which sounds like something a DJ would say, which is kind of appropriate because this episode is going to be all about music. Music, which famously has effects on the emotions, is a big motivating force for a lot of people to do a lot of things, change the world through music and all that. And not surprisingly, when scientists look at the brain and what's going on when we listen to and experience music, there's a lot to be seen, and we're going to be talking with not one but two different scientists, each of whom study music, looking at it from slightly different aspects. Dr. Robert Zatorre, who looks at how and why we enjoy music, how music can engage the reward centers of the brain, and Dr. Assal Habibi, who's involved with an ongoing study looking at how music as a developmental intervention can impact children's brains as they age. We'll be meeting with both these experts in the main interview, and if you hang around until the very end of the episode, we'll be keeping the ruthless listener retention gimmick music related, talking about earworms, those songs that have a particular proclivity to getting stuck in people's heads, and why some songs do and other songs don't. There's actually a bit of science behind this, so hang around to find that out. But first, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So in the world of the internet, when you see something that's like a headline, which is maybe playing on your lower impulses, something which is encouraging titillation or schadenfreude or something like that, we call that clickbait. And it's always kind of funny when you see clickbait in a scientific headline because it's either ironic or funny or satisfying or all of the above to see scientists kind of stoop to that level. I'm certainly no saint when it comes to this myself, but I couldn't help but read this recent article based on a new study just published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society with the title, "Longer Penis Drives the Evolution of Bigger Brains in Female Fish." How can you not be curious? And I was. And it's always funny kind of looking at mating strategies throughout the animal kingdom because it really dispels you quickly of the Disney version of romance, at least in some cases. When I was a kid, we had ducks, and like my mom raised ducks for a while. But mallard ducks, their mating system is not in the least romantic. It's basically mallard ducks participate as a species. Gang rape is basically their means of procreation. And if you believe in reincarnation, you would not want to be reincarnated as a female mallard duck. Apparently, it's a bit similar with a fish called the mosquito fish. This is a relative of the guppy, and the male mosquito fish makes no effort to court his female partners. Instead, he sneaks up on them and attempts to copulate by force up to 1,000 times a day, which has got to be a humbling number to even the most committed serial rapist out there. But unsurprisingly, this is not appreciated by the female mosquito fish. And the conjecture between the scientists looking at these animals is that the relationship between the sexes is essentially a predator-prey relationship, and you might see some of the telltale signs of that evolutionarily speaking if you look at the differences between the males and females of the species. In the quintessential predator-prey relationship, where one animal species is eating another, you'll oftentimes see evolutionary arms races. For example, big-brained predators tend to have big-brained prey as the two try to continually outsmart one another. In the case of mosquito fish, the scientists knew that the males that have a larger gonopodium, which you can think of as being analogous to a penis, it is technically a modified anal fin. So this article just gets more and more salacious in its terminology, but that is what they use to deliver sperm into the female. And it's the male mosquito fish that have the larger gonopodium that tend to be more successful in mating or in raping the female mosquito fish. Now, in related fish species where sexual coercion is not the dominant mating strategy, the males with the larger penises are not any more successful at mating than their lesser endowed peers. And even though you might think that although this is kind of a barbaric mating strategy, because it leads to offspring and the survival of the species and all that stuff, basically mating would be in the benefit of both the males and the females, but not so much actually, because since the males are so overzealous about it, 1,000 times a day is clearly overkill. The battered females of this species can actually pick up injuries and things like that, so it's to their benefit, evolutionarily speaking, as well as everything else, to be able to dodge these predatory males. So the scientists in this study, making a bad situation worse for the female mosquito fish, they did something that would never pass an ethics board were this a human trial. They actually bred a line of males that had even larger penises than the existing ones, and were therefore more dangerous to the females of the fish species. And what they found in this artificial evolutionary experiment, they actually saw the development in the females of the species, not the males, of larger brains. So that predator-prey model actually held up. As the males got more dangerous, the females got more clever so they could try to get out of harm's way, said researcher Severin Buchel from Stockholm University in Sweden. Mating systems are an overlooked factor in brain evolution, and they've been studied much more in species in which the females exert some choice over whom they mate with and when. But depending on what mating strategy has been adopted, brain evolution might have gone in different directions. Reviewing the work, Jonathan Evans from the University of Western Australia said, "It's an interesting idea, but we can't say for sure if the selection of bigger-brained females happens in the wild. The next step the scientists are hoping to study is to see if the larger-brained females are actually better at avoiding the male mating attempts. Right now, they've seen that their brains are getting larger, but whether this is useful for outsmarting the mosquito fish rapists or for something else is yet to be determined."
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews in my early holiday stocking over on iTunes. Listener Plinian Put from the USA says, "I've always been interested in overall health, but since I sustained a traumatic brain injury 1 year ago, I've dived into optimizing my brain health. This podcast has covered many of the bases that concern not just getting smarter, but overall brain and body health. Great work." And Spurzak from Canada says, "I love listening to Smart Drug Smarts, and I had to leave a review after listening to an episode on my favorite subject." He does not mention what his favorite subject is, but this was left on November 25th, so we could do some historical detective work and figure it out. "This podcast is fun, entertaining, easy to listen to, informative, interesting, and forward-thinking." Well, thank you guys, and thank you to everyone who has been listening, spreading the word on Smart Drug Smarts, signing up for the Brain Breakfast newsletter. That Brain Breakfast newsletter, I will bang the gong again, is available at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And we're actually adding some stuff to that for people that are just finding the podcast now, offering a bit of a retrospective, here's some things, some episodes you might have missed that you want to check out, guided tour of the increasingly long and grand history of Smart Drug Smarts. Also wanted to share a link that was thrown at me this past week by Rhiannon of the Smart Drug Smarts team. This is a really cool little YouTube video. It's kind of the least Christmassy thing ever, so it's exactly the antithesis, I guess, to the Christmas holiday season, because it's proposing that rather than use the birth of Christ as sort of the standard calendar, that we actually add 10,000 years to the standard dating, and instead of make this coming year the year 2017, make it the year 12,017 instead, and kind of reframe human history with the inception point being the first documentable massive architectural projects from very, very early civilization. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I will certainly embarrass myself. Well, shucks, now I'm going to try. Going from memory, it's something called Göbekli Tepe or something like that. There was a massive temple complex that was discovered in what's modern Turkey within the last decade or so. Maybe it was about 15 years ago now, but it is dated to just around 12,000 years ago. And anyway, this YouTube video makes a compelling argument for sort of making that the kickoff point of human civilization, and how that gives it a more interesting way of looking at the way that human progress is on this accelerating tempo as we get closer and closer to the modern day that we find ourselves living in. It's got great little icon animations. It's a really well done video, and I think a compelling idea. We'll put the link up for that on smartdrugsmarts.com/159. Worth checking out and spreading around. Definitely has our stamp of approval. Also having our stamp of approval, and something that we go back to more than any YouTube video, even our most favorites, are of course the supplement stacks over at Axon Labs, Nexus and Mitogen. I've got some Nexus in my system right now. Are a homebrew mix of aniracetam, CDP, choline, and some other good stuff. And Mitogen. I did not have any Mitogen today. Mitogen's got sulbuthiamine. It's got some great cognitive boosting compounds in it, but I also tend to find it gets me sort of physically charged up, and typically I'll take it on workout days, sometimes not on the days that I don't. Today was not a workout day for me, but both of those, Nexus and Mitogen, can be found on the web at axonlabs.io. Very much appreciate those of you who have been checking those out and coming back for more. There's actually the ability to set up monthly subscriptions to Nexus and Mitogen, in addition to doing one-time purchases, and definitely some cost savings associated with the subscriptions. I can hardly imagine a nicer gift for somebody going into 2017 than an unexpected Nexus or Mitogen gift subscription. I would be asking for that myself, except that I've already got a lot of both. But there's probably some people on your holiday lists that don't, so bear that in mind, and do take a spin over to axonlabs.io. So we're going to be getting deeply into music in the coming conversation here. We've got two experts in this episode, but obviously it's such a deep topic, it's something that we'll probably return to in the future. If you've got particular musical studies or fascinations or intersections of music and brain stuff that you're aware of that we wind up not touching on in this episode, definitely drop a line, drop an email, send links my way. I'm very open to diving back into this in the future again. And also, fair warning, this is going to be a longer episode than normal, almost 45 minutes for the combined interviews here. But anyway, time to give myself the vaudeville hook, make room for our main guests, and hop ahead to the main interview. So as you know, we get a lot of listener requests for various episodes covering different topics, and we'll oftentimes go out and try to harpoon experts that are appropriate to the questions people are asking. And this episode definitely falls under that category. Needless to say, there are a whole lot of music fans out there, and music seems like it's one of those uniquely human things. There are certainly other animals out there that make music, but both the variety of human music and the fact that it seems like it's something that we do for its own sake rather than as a means of communication, or at least not denotative communication. Given that we're over 150 episodes in, we're probably long overdue for a music episode. Trying to make up for that now, we actually have two experts that we're going to be talking to who approach music from a couple of different angles. Dr. Robert Zatorre is a professor up at McGill University in Montreal, as well as being a researcher at the Montreal Neurological Institute and Hospital. And he's been involved in a huge amount of studies of music and cognition, probably one of the main scholars in this area really pushing this study forward. And Dr. Assal Habibi is with the University of Southern California's Cognitive Psychology Department, and she's been doing research specifically into how music can affect the developing brain of juveniles. She's publishing papers like The Neural Correlates of Accelerated Auditory Processing in Children Engaged in Music Training, just to give a sample. So in the coming interview, we're going to be cross-cutting between these two researchers, looking at both the theory and the practice of music and its variety of effects on the brain, why we care about it as much as we do, and what music might be able to do for us. So crank up the volume and prime your ears for Drs. Robert Zatorre and Assal Habibi.
As a kid, I was always interested in science, in fact, but somewhere in adolescence, I got stung by the music bug, which happens to a lot of adolescents. So I did an undergraduate degree in music and simultaneously did a science degree at the same time. And at some point, I realized, all my friends who are in the music program are actually way better than I am. But when I'm in my science classes, I can pretty much do pretty well. And so I thought, okay, if I'm going to go for advanced studies, I really should go for the science. But I didn't want to give up on the music because it was very meaningful to me, and I had learned a certain amount. And so when I went to do my PhD, I somehow convinced my PhD supervisor that, well, maybe one should study music, because at the time there was hardly anything at all sort of scientific looking at how people perceive and process music. And I think as soon as I began working on this, I realized there was an entire kind of open area of research that hadn't been touched much.
We know that children from underserved communities do not get opportunities as frequently as children from more affluent background to be exposed to music. And that was a thought in our mind when we started this study of just this observation of knowing that a lot of art education and music education programs are being cut out of the budget within our public education system, and figuring out what is the best way to push for policies to bring these programs back to at least give that opportunity to kids who cannot afford having private lessons. And we looked at many programs in Southern California. That's where our institute is at USC. And we came across a program that is called the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. And it's a program that is supported by the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Now, this was inspired by the famous music training program from Venezuela called El Sistema. It was not only a music training program, it was using music to introduce social change and to bring social justice. So the idea was that we bring all these children, we give them musical instruments, we take them off the streets, and that would already induce this cohesion in a society, and have when kids play together, they are able to understand each other better. And we thought that this is really an interesting idea, and the LA Phil was supporting the program in the LA area. So it's a free program that is offered to families from underserved communities. Children go to this program 5 days a week for about 2 hours a day, and they're provided with free instruments. Now, everything is done in a group setting, so there is no one-to-one instruction. Everything is an ensemble training, so there is a teacher assistant and a conductor or the main teacher who leads the orchestra.
Do all known human cultures engage in some form of music? Are there any musicless tribes hidden in the far reaches of the Amazon or anything like that?
As far as I know, music really is found in every culture. However, it varies tremendously in the way that it's expressed. And there are some common features that are found in essentially all cultures, and others that are sort of optional, that are found in some cultures and not others. Of course, there are cultures where they've tried to suppress the music, even though it exists. So, like famously, the Taliban, when they were in charge in Afghanistan, actually banned music because they felt it was too dangerous and takes people away from appropriate worship. It didn't work, by the way.
I would think that'd be a tough thing to stamp out. I think they tried that in that 1980s movie with Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, right, exactly. So then it goes underground. Like most things that are really part of human nature, when you try to control them and try to eliminate them, it's almost impossible. But yeah, I think music is found in all cultures, and in that respect, it's universal. And I think that's because it is an expression of our human brain. It is much like language in that respect. All human cultures have language. Every infant is born with the capacity to speak very complex languages. And so similarly, every infant, I think, is born with the capacity for music, with some interesting exceptions that I think I'd like to get to later on.
So there's an aspect of cohesion and helping each other that is part of the program that we thought is really interesting. And given that the costs of these group training programs are a lot less than having to provide one-to-one individual training for each student, we figured that if we could show these programs are successful, both in terms of creating benefits in emotional and social domain for children, and also like biological brain development, we could argue that if we cannot afford having one-to-one private lessons for every child, we can bring these group music lessons back to school, either as part of the school curriculum or as an after-school program that is offered in public school education system.
So in your current study, what age did the kids start? What age are they typically now?
Yeah, so they started at 6. So we collected a series of measures from them, including both measures of their brain function and their brain structure using magnetic resonance imaging, looking at the physiology of their nervous system using electroencephalography, and a series of psychological measures like looking at their language development, their cognitive abilities, also social emotional abilities, like how much empathy they have towards each other, how much compassion, would they go out of their way to help each other. And we did all of these measures right before they went to their music program and right before they started school. So in the summer before the school started when they were 6. Right now, we are in year 4 of our data collection, and the kids are about to go up to 5th grade and finishing the elementary school years. This study is originally designed for 5 years, so between 6 to 12. However, we are very much interested to see, because we have all these great measures and data from these students, to see if we can, the benefits that we have seen that we can talk about, and we are really interested to see if those benefits carry on. In middle school, your social environment is more complex and you have to do more complicated decision making. So we want to see if the benefits that we have seen during this younger age can extend to those older age.
That feeling of an intense and emotional chills going up or down the spine that can sometimes happen near the crescendo of a song that a person really likes. It can happen in other things too, like the emotionally moving parts of movies and things like that. But music seems to be a particularly reliable way of bringing that feeling out. What exactly is going on there?
Yeah, music is a very strong trigger of that kind of emotion. And in fact, it's relatively rare in other art forms, I think. You mentioned movies, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the movie it's largely related to the music. Not to take anything away, say, from visual arts, but if you look at a magnificent painting, it may be absolutely wonderful in many respects, but it's unlikely to give you the sort of chills or shivers. But the reason we started looking at that, it's kind of a funny story. I had a very good postdoctoral fellow, Anne Blood, who actually is now on the faculty at Harvard. And she came to work with me and said, Robert, we have to study how people respond to music emotionally. But different people have really different tastes, and how are we going to do this? And so we started talking, and I said, well, so for instance, like, what's your favorite about music? And she said, well, I'm a drummer and I like hard rock and metal. So I'm an organist and I like 17th century North German Baroque music. How can we study this? And then we got to talking and we realized that although our styles are extremely different, we both felt this intense pleasure at certain moments of the music, and that we felt this response that we call chills or shivers, or it's called frisson as well.
Yeah.
And then we said, aha, that's the way we're going to study it, because even though our musical tastes may differ, the physiology that we're experiencing during a particularly pleasurable moment of the music is the same. And so what if we scan people's brains when they're in that state? That was the reason we started looking at it, is because it was a way to kind of get rid of this pretty complex problem of why different people have different tastes in music, which is not what we were interested in. What we were interested in is what is happening when you do experience pleasure. So given that you're experiencing the pleasure, irrespective of how that state was arrived at, what's going on in the brain? And so that was really the start of it all. This is back in the year 2000. And what we found was that there were certain brain structures that were active, and these structures are very relevant because they had been long ago identified as being involved in what psychologists call reward. And in fact, the very first few studies of this were done in rats. Actually, it was done here at McGill University back in the 1950s by Olds and Milner. And what they found was the famous reward center, which is kind of slightly a misnomer, but the point is that if you give a rat a certain amount of food when it's hungry and you measure its responses from different areas of the brain, there are a few particular regions that respond very, very strongly when the animal receives this reward. In other words, something that it really is craving because it's hungry, it wants food.
Yeah.
And so those regions, which are known under various names as the reward circuit or one particular part of the reward circuit called the striatum, this area of the striatum had been known for a long time as being important, 50 years at least. And so when we looked at our brain scans, we said, wait a second, this is the striatum. This is the part of the brain that is supposed to be important for these biologically meaningful stimuli, like food to a hungry animal.
Yeah.
And then we started delving into this literature, and we found that this reward circuitry is also involved in other sort of biologically meaningful activities. So, for example, sex results in activity of the striatum because it makes sense. It's a stimulus, if you will, that's important for survival, maybe not of the individual, but of the entire species. And then we started finding other things, like, for example, certain kinds of drugs activate some portions of the reward circuitry, in particular things like amphetamines and nicotine, as well as cocaine. So we thought maybe we're onto something here that should be explored further. So that was sort of the beginning of that whole story.
Using music as really an intervention to understand brain plasticity has really gained strength in the field of neuroscience. Because it's still a young field, it's still not as established to be able to get these larger grants to support a large study like this. So we had help from fundraising. Given that we had really promising findings and we established a really good relationship with participants of our study, which on its own was challenging, but we were able to maintain a very high percentage, around 80% of the originally recruited participants in this study.
What is the cohort size of the kids in this study originally?
We have recruited 25 students from this group of children who are doing music. Now, when you look at child development, you always also wanted to look at a comparison group because children, obviously, they get better with their language and their reading abilities and their cognitive abilities and understanding emotion as they get older. So some of these effects could be just because of development itself. And then our other idea was also that maybe some of the effects that we see has nothing to do with music training, but it could be just being exposed to a group activity. So you go somewhere, you get attention, you play with your peers, and you feel belong to in a sense of community. So we also wanted to control for that factor. So in all, we have 3 groups. The music group, as I said, has 25 students. And we have also 2 comparison groups, children from the same communities. One group of them, we call them sports, and they were recruited from community soccer programs or swimming programs in the area. Also, we started to test them prior that they enrolled in their sports program, and they have been following with their sports respectively the past 4 years. And that's also a group of 25. And then for the third group, we have a comparison group of children who are from the public education systems around the area. They're not necessarily enrolled in any specific after-school program, so we call them control comparison, and they're also 25. So 3 groups of 25 children for a total of 75. Now, because I said this control comparison group, I just wanted to clarify because I always get a lot of questions of, well, how do you stop them from doing music or how do you stop them from doing sports? And of course we don't because it's not ethical for one thing.
You're only allowed to play video games.
Yes, exactly. For the next 5 years, don't do anything that benefits your life. No, we kind of looked at the frequency that the children in the music and the sports group take lessons. So as I said, the music is 5 days a week and the sports program is about as frequent. It's about 4 days a week with a little less amount of time just because physically children, especially when they were younger, they cannot play for 2 hours every day. So they were frequent and they had some intensity that were close to each other. Now, if a child from our third control group, let's say, took recorded lesson 1 hour a week in the school, we don't count that against them. However, if they move to a more intense program, we continue to study them, but we don't count them in our analysis.
It's funny to think exactly what the evolutionary advantage of humans liking music is.
There are different models about this. There is good evidence that young infants do respond to music-like sounds, in particular the intonation patterns of voices. They're very sensitive to voices, particularly the mom's voice. And of course, moms sing to their children in practically every culture. So it's a way of interacting with the child and either soothing it if it's upset or arousing it if it's kind of sleepy. But I think music serves many many different functions. Different people have speculated about the origins of music. There's also a social function, social bonding, for example. There are a number of different explanations. The one that we're focusing on is a little bit different. These are not mutually exclusive, so our idea is not really in conflict with any of the others. It's just an additional idea, which is more about the abstractness of music. So a lot of music is quite abstract in the sense that it doesn't refer to any specific item. And this is different than language, because when we're speaking, what we're speaking about, there's a referent to what we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about something, and we can give quite precise instructions when we're speaking. With music, for the most part, with some exceptions, it's not really about that. It's more about the patterns of sound. The patterns themselves are intrinsically beautiful. And a number of music theorists have proposed that what happens is that when you hear a sequence of sounds, it sets up an expectation of what the subsequent series of sounds ought to be, and that the musician or the composer or the person who's singing or playing will kind of manipulate that degree of expectancy to create a pleasurable sensation. So it's this idea of tension and resolution, for example. There was a famous theorist named Leonard Meyer who proposed this model back in the 1950s. And what we found in our neuroscience experiments, in fact, is quite consistent with this, because in further studies that we did after those initial ones, one of my former PhD students, Valerie Salampour, did some very nice studies where she looked at this chills phenomenon and looked at the brain responses before and after the chills. In other words, we scanned people, we asked them to indicate when they felt the chills, and we knew this anyway because we could measure the physiological responses. We can see that the heart rate goes up and that the respiration rate goes up and that the skin conductance, which is an index of arousal, it all goes up at that moment.
Yeah.
And then we looked in the brain to see what's happening in the few seconds before and the few seconds after. And what we saw were that there were two separate regions of the striatum. This is the same structure I mentioned before. Two separate subregions, both of which involve dopamine, by the way. So what we saw is that just prior to the moment of maximum pleasure, we call the anticipation phase, 10 seconds to 15 seconds prior to that moment, there's a response in what we call the dorsal striatum, which is just a little bit above the ventral striatum. So there's two sort of subsections. And then at the moment of the peak pleasure, the dorsal striatum drops down in its responses and the ventral striatum goes up in its responses. And the reason that's important is because of the way that those two subregions are connected. So the first one, the dorsal striatum, which is active during this anticipation, that part of the brain is connected to all the most evolutionarily recent structures in the brain, like the frontal cortex and the cingulate cortex and other areas. All of these are involved in things like prediction, anticipation, decision-making, trying to figure out what's coming next. Whereas the other one, ventral striatum, is more connected to more ancient structures like the amygdala and parts of the brainstem, which are involved, if I can sort of oversimplify it a bit, they're involved in things that might be called raw emotion. So the actual feeling, the actual hedonic response. It's the pleasure. It's the moment when you feel the chill and you go, oh, that's
right.
so wonderful. And so there's this interplay between the more advanced part of the brain, which is the frontal cortex. By advanced, I mean, more highly developed in humans, which allows us to make predictions. It allows us to anticipate what's coming up. And that sort of circuit is more active at the beginning, prior to the moment of the peak pleasure. And then the other circuit kicks in, which is sort of pure pleasure. And this finding, so this result from the brain, actually makes perfect sense with respect to what the musicologists were telling us 50 or more years ago. So a nice way that these results are sort of coherent with existing theories.
I guess I'm curious as to whether something that has a physical instrument versus something like choir, where a person is just bringing their voice, whether you suspect there might be any differences there. And also the differences between the type of training that you did as sort of an intensive single person, but not a group activity, versus something that's more like a choir or a band or an orchestra where you're working with other kids.
Yeah, no, the question of choir is a really good question. And I think it's a lot of fun for kids to be part of a choir, and especially when the kids are young and holding a physical instrument is difficult for them. They can't do it for a long time. There's a lot you can do with your voice. You can sing along, you can just go low, high. I mean, it's more of an engaging. So I think that's a really good also introduction for the kids. A lot of these early childhood music programs have an aspect of choir or sing along together. And also one of the things that I think is important, so I was trained classical music, and even the program we are studying has a classical model. So the kids get to play the classical repertoire. But in addition to that, if children also get to play play things that they can relate to emotionally, whether that's music from their culture. So a lot of the kids that are in our study are from Latino background. So if they can play the music that their parents listen at home, or they heard at a family's party, or if they can play music from the movies they like. If they want to play Star Wars, it's okay. Star Wars has a melody. They can play that. And that brings some connection that maybe those more classical repertoire by themselves would not, because they probably cannot connect with music from 2 centuries ago in the same way that they can go to their friends and say, oh, I know how to play this thing for Star Wars. So I think being sort of open-minded in the sense of we are trying to teach music, and then once they learn the basic, and if they understand, they make the connection emotionally and cognitively understand the value that this brings to their life, they will gravitate to more complicated and more the classical repertoire that we know of.
What do you feel like the evolutionary pressure was for us to gain this strong species-wide appreciation, like this dramatic and predictable release of dopamine? I mean, it seems like normally it would be there to motivate us to do something, but in the case of music, there's not a clear result that our biology seems to be aiming us to do other than just to appreciate.
I'd like to cite the work of a friend of mine who has thought about this carefully, Ani Patel, who's a psychologist at Tufts. And he has a nice theory. He basically says, well, maybe music kind of evolved almost by accident, in the sense that the individual capacities that are necessary for music each evolved for a separate reason. So our ability to perceive certain patterns of sound evolved long ago because it's really important to perceive sound, because it helps you navigate your environment and listen for different events that might be important, to listen for a predator who's after you, or to listen for prey that you may want to go after. Similarly, the ability to move, ability to manipulate our fingers and hands, it's incredibly useful for survival, for making tools, for everything. And once you have all these capacities together, then make music kind of emerges. But the point that he makes is that this doesn't mean that music has no function. It just means that you don't need to assume that there was evolutionary pressure to develop music. Then it becomes useful, and it becomes useful in many ways, including things like we were saying earlier, such as social bonding, the mother-child interaction, synchronizing activities, so people singing together when they're working together on a task, etc. And the analogy that he draws is something like fire. So our ability to control fire did not evolve specifically, evolved because we have the cognitive capacity to understand that when you rub 2 sticks together, they heat up and then eventually they flare up into a fire. And we have the visual capacity to recognize when there's smoke and how it's related to fire. And we have the motor capacity to make fire occur, etc. But if you've got the fire, well, then you have an incredibly useful tool that you can use for all kinds of other purposes.
Right.
But the capacity to create fire was not selected for as such. Other capacities were selected for, which then allow us to develop technologies. And so fire is a technology in that sense, and music can be thought of in the same way as a technology that we sort of were lucky to hit upon. But now that we have it, well, we realize that it has lots of useful properties.
It's interesting, though. I mean, I find that a very compelling argument, and yet what you showed with the brain's response, the striatum's response to musical pleasure, I mean, there isn't like a parallel to something like that with the relief that we get when we get a campfire started. The fact that there is such a measurable physiological response in the case of music, it just makes it feel like it's maybe something a little deeper.
Yeah, so the parallel with fire I don't think extends to the emotional response. However, this whole idea of making predictions and getting the outcome, humans are very sensitive to that. This is why things like puzzles and riddles have been popular in all human cultures, I think. And games, lots of games have to do with anticipating a certain outcome, and then you get surprised when the outcome is, slightly different than what you predicted. So I think many forms of complex human activity, including stories and poems and dances and so forth, all have this element making predictions, anticipating the outcome, and then being rewarded when you get a certain outcome.
What are some of the things that we might expect to see in a study like this, and what has your data actually shown so far in the first 4 years?
Part of our expectation as we went to pre-hypotheses was to see differences in the abilities that rely on sound. So processing of sound, whether it's pitch and rhythm perception, and the areas of the brain that are engaged in that processing, the auditory cortices, the areas of language processing, and the motor cortex, because you are training this fine motor movement on your hands and you do this visual and motor integration. Another thing that we were expecting when we were going through, given the emphasis on the social control and group aspect was to find out whether the music actually does something for you in terms of your social behavior, your emotional behavior, their ability to connect with another person. Because to me, the question was, okay, there's been a lot of evidence showing that music training is good for language development. It's good for mathematical skills. If it does help in all these cognitive elements, but it doesn't help you become a better citizen in the world, like you cannot relate with your peers or friends, it would be nice if it had this more holistic impact. So when we started, these were kind of our hypotheses going through it. Now, child development is a process that is very strong. When we compare children, we always have to exclude any effect that is related to development. And children during those years really go through this very massive development of their frontal areas of the brain, decision-making, emotion processing, and even language. Like when we test them from year 1 to year 3, you can just really see this massive change in their language abilities, regardless of they're from the music, sports, or control program.
Sure.
So after controlling for all these values, the general picture that we have observed, the very beginning things that we started to see after 2 years of training was changes in the perception of sound. So we started to see that children who were in the music group, they were showing sign that they process music and sound, whether that was speech or sound from the nature, different from the two other groups. So they perceive pitch differently, like they were more accurate in detecting changes in the pitch environment, in the rhythm environment, and they were also better in coordinating, like if they had to keep a beat on a drum. So both pitch production and pitch perception and rhythm perception and rhythm production, as soon as about 2 years of training, started to change and we started to see differences. As we moved along, after looking at some of the brain data, some of the electrophysiology data, we observed, this is a paper that we put out last year, looking at the development of the auditory pathway. So this is a pathway that connects the ear. So when the sound, the stimulus hits ear, and it takes the information all the way to the thalamus, the center executive part of the brain, and from there to the auditory sensory areas. And we saw that a faster maturation of this pathway in children who have had music training compared to two other groups. And by that meaning that this pathway had the function that it was more like adult-like in the children who have had music training compared to the other groups. And it was very promising. It's kind of nice to see this is the pathway and system of the brain that is stimulated by sound. And so they were getting this music stimulation. And the fact that it has impacted this was an evidence that the music program was working and children were training. And we also observed that their level of expertise, the better they're played, we observed these differences more clearly. Now, even though this pathway is engaged in music, it also is engaged in any other domain that relies on sound, whether that is language or successful communication. So as the years have gone by, now have seen we're working on a paper to put out after 3 years of training, we have seen advantages in language domain. So for example, in verbal memory, the children who have had music training are better in holding some verbal information in their memory and recalling it later. In executive function, meaning that they're able to use working memory and inhibitory skills to perform on an executive function task better. So really the change, it seems that it has started with the auditory pathway and the sensory system. And now as they train more and they become more advanced in their training, it's expanding to more cognitive and language areas and memory and attention compared to the other groups. Now the result after 5 years is waiting to be seen as we collect data, but it seems that this is the direction that we are moving towards.
Because we have a very complex brain, we are able to derive pleasure from many complicated abstract patterns that have this property of engaging your reward system by virtue of making predictions and then checking whether the outcome is in line with your prediction or not. Music happens to really engage that system particularly well, possibly because it extends over time, so it's a constant sequence of events, and possibly because it's like a linked sequence of events. In other words, each sound kind of predicts the next sound, which predicts the next sound, which predicts the next sound.
Right.
Constant flow of information coming at you. And so I think that's an extremely powerful way to engage this sensory prediction system. And that's why we get intense pleasure much of the time from musical patterns.
What do we know, if anything, about the general differences between the brains of people that are big music fans, the people that are kind of so-so ho-hum, people that are musicians versus people who are merely music enjoyers?
So I think this brings me to this other topic that I wanted to touch on, which is that when we first started doing this research, we sort of assumed, well, everyone loves music. And indeed, it's not hard to find people who love music. Almost everyone seems to really enjoy it. And we know, music is a huge business in the modern world, and that's because it's so widespread. But a few years ago, actually, I took a sabbatical musical year, and I decided to go to Barcelona because it's a beautiful city. I wanted to be on the shores of the Mediterranean. So while I was there, I met up with a group of scientists who were studying what is known as anhedonia. Anhedonia is a feature of depression where people don't get enjoyment. So they don't enjoy normal things that everyone else enjoys. They were already experts in this area. And so in talking to them, we came around to the idea that, hey, maybe we should look at whether, in fact, everyone gets enjoyment from music. Is there such a thing as musical anhedonia? So are there people who don't enjoy music? Or conversely, are there people who are hyperhedonic, who are just absolute music lovers? To make a long story short, we developed various techniques to examine this, and we found that indeed there is a small but significant group of people, about 2% of the population roughly, depending on exactly how you measure it, who are perfectly normal and average in every way, except that they do not derive enjoyment from music. Importantly, they derive enjoyment from everything else that everyone else enjoys. So all those things we talked about, food and sex and social interactions and family ties and movies and books, like whatever most people like, these people like as well. So they're not depressed. They don't have overwhelming psychiatric symptom or anything like that. And furthermore, their ability to perceive the music is perfectly normal, because there's a separate condition known as amusia, which is where people have a perceptual disorder. Music sounds sort of weird to them. It sounds meaningless, like a meaningless jumble of noise. And so those people, of course, don't derive enjoyment from music.
Sort of like the musical equivalent of dyslexia.
Yeah, I think that's exactly a good analogy. So music for them is perceptually meaningless. So therefore, they don't have the capacity to enjoy it. But these people with musical anhedonia can perceive music perfectly well. In fact, they will be able to say things like, well, this is meant to be a sad piece of music. This one's meant to be happy. This one's a march. This one's a waltz. They can describe it in any way that everyone else can. But when you ask them, but do you actually feel that pleasure or that sadness or whatever, they say, no, it just leaves me cold. And when we started studying them, some of them said to us, I'm so glad that you are identifying this situation. And I'm really glad to know there are other people like me, because through all my life, people have been telling me, what's wrong with you? What do you mean you don't like music?
So executive function is a series of skills that now are known to be really high predictive of success in life, whether that is academic success, job success, and even relationship success. And there are like 3 core skills that define executive function. It's working memory, ability to switch tasks, so be flexible, and also inhibition. So inhibiting from having a reward right now to have it 2 days later, to understand that, I can have a larger reward later. And in that executive function domain, we use a fMRI paradigm, and we saw that the music group outperformed the other 2 groups in that task. However, the sports group is kind of like in the middle. So it went music, sports, control. So the sports groups were still better than the children with no exposure to any systematic training. So part of it obviously comes from engagement in a group activity and engagement in discipline and frequent activity. And then the extra part has come from music. I always like to clarify that we have never had the intention of saying whether music is better than sports, or one is better or one should be or one shouldn't be. Me and both the directors of HCW are very much on the agreement and understanding that all of these are necessary for children. We know that physical education is essential in child development. We just chose this because we wanted to have an activity that is compatible to what we were looking at in terms of music.
It seems that the level of discipline in a 6 to 10-year-old participating in sports might not be the same level of intense focus and discipline that's expected of a kid learning an instrument. Is there an intentional discipline matching going on? Because if not, that seems like that could be throwing your data out of whack a bit.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of discipline, I have asked this question and then kind of understand how the 2 programs are compatible in that sense. So both of them require regular attendance to their program. Now, what is different that I think between the 2 is actually the social aspect. So the social aspect with playing an orchestra is maybe just to let's help each other for the orchestra to sound well, and there is not a specific star in there or somebody who's really good and we're all helping out. They're not at that age that they have like the first violin or the solo player.
Right.
Whereas in the sports, it seems to be more of a little bit sense of competition of we against the other team. And then maybe there's a star who's better or there's like a kid who's playing guitar. So I think the social relationships are a little bit different between the two programs. However, I have observed that in both of the sports programs that we're looking at, there is this attention being directed towards this social activity. We all want to help each other. We're all here, especially I think with these children who we study, because the communities they come from and a lot of the schools, there's this lack of sense of belongingness that in the end, when they get a little bit older through middle school or high school, it really increases the chance of them getting involved with gang activities. But if they have this sense of belongingness to a community and knowing that by their participation, they make a difference. So they're told, for example, that, if you don't show up today, the team is going to miss a person. So we're not going to do this. So it's important that you show up and it's important that you follow through. And I feel that sense is the core of their understanding and kind of connecting with the activity.
Well, you won't be surprised, of course, that if you take a group of musicians, you will find that the vast majority of them also score very highly on loving music.
Sure.
In other experiments unrelated to these, we have looked at the brains of musicians, and we certainly do find interesting effects going on there. Basically, they have better interactions between the part of their brains that process sound and the parts of their brains that execute movements, which makes sense because when you play an instrument, you have exquisite motor control over the instrument, and at the same time, you have a very finely developed ear. As people say, it's the ear, but of course it's not the ear, it's the brain. And importantly, it's the communication between those two. So to play an instrument, you have to not only execute a series of movements in a very skilled fashion, you have to be sure to monitor the sound produced by those movements in order to make extremely fine adjustments. And we're currently doing some very cool experiments. We have a cello that was designed by us, and this is a strange cello that is very narrow and small and can fit into an MRI scanner.
Huh.
And so we're actually getting people to play inside the scanner and looking at what's going on in the brains of highly skilled cellists as they execute certain movements. And that is indeed what we're seeing, is that there's this much more developed interplay between the motor system and the auditory system.
What studies would you like to do next?
So we're doing, I think, some interesting studies. We're doing things like training studies. We're looking at what happens if you take someone who, let's say, doesn't know how to play the cello and you give them lessons and you monitor what goes on in their brain. We want to see how does this change, and also how is it that some individuals will learn fairly well and others won't be so good. Why is it that there are these discrepancies that any music teacher will tell you that some of their students are quote unquote gifted and others are just not cut out to be musicians? We'd like to understand why that might be the case. In terms of the musical pleasure kind of idea, we're currently doing some experiments that I think may turn out to be quite exciting, where we're using a totally different technique, which is a brain stimulation technique. So this is a way to modulate brain activity. So you can actually change the excitability of the brain tissue, either to kind of boost it or to suppress it.
Is this like transcranial direct current stimulation, or is it actually something internal?
It's actually a transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it's basically a coil, and you pass a current through the coil, which produces a magnetic pulse. The pulse goes through the skull and causes depolarization of the neurons, so just brain activity. And like I said, you can either inhibit ongoing activity, or you can suppress it by a certain percentage, or you can boost it.
I'm wondering about deaf children. I imagine that a deaf child might be able to actually do percussion because they can still get tactile feedback rather than auditory feedback. Is that something that's done? Is there any sort of music training for deaf children?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know actually of any program. What you're saying intuitively makes a lot of sense, especially with drums and coordination of drumming.
Yeah.
I'm aware of programs for children who are blind and music training. And actually, there is some evidence that we actually have studied an adult musician who is blind, an opera singer, that in a very fascinating way, she has this extremely exceptional musical skills. And when we look at her brain in the scanner, when she processes music, not only she engages her auditory cortex, but also her visual cortex. So the cortex that doesn't engage in doing the visual activity of every day is now being served as processing auditory information that is crucial to her life. And she uses that as a primary way of navigating the world. So yeah, I'm aware of programs for blind children, but not for deaf. But that seems really intuitive in terms of especially coordination and entrainment across drumming.
Did you see anything in your study, almost like a refractory period for the enjoyment of music? Like if you could play me my favorite song, and I'm sure I'll get a big spike of enjoyment the first time, but if I listen to the same song 10 times in a row, even if it is my favorite song, the enjoyment will diminish.
Yeah.
What's going on there? Does that play into, I guess, the idea of anticipation, expectation at this point when I know exactly what's going to happen? It just doesn't have the same tickle for me?
Yeah, exactly. So that phenomenon you described has, of course, been studied. And I think that's exactly what's going on, is that if this model of anticipating the outcome is valid, once you know exactly what the outcome will be, there's no longer any anticipation. You know exactly what will happen. So the reward value falls off. And this is also related to the concept that, well, people like to listen to music that has the right level of predictability and unpredictability. So if you take music that's extremely repetitive, for instance, kids' music, it's because children don't have the mental capacity to appreciate too much complexity. So kids' music tends to be extremely repetitive. Any adult who's had a toddler knows how annoying that music can be after a while. And that's because it's very, very predictable and very, very simple, right? Conversely, if you are very musically experienced and sophisticated, if you have a lot of musical training, for example, or if you have listened to a lot of music of a particular genre, you probably will be tending towards the more complex end. So a good example of this is jazz, where if you're not a jazz lover and you listen to John Coltrane, you have no idea what's going on because it's extremely complex. So your ability to make the predictions and to understand the outcomes of those predictions is very limited. But if you have enough experience and possibly training in jazz, you will understand at least some of what he's doing, and you'll really get a lot more appreciation out of it for that reason. So there has to be kind of a match between your ability to make those predictions and the complexity of the music. So if it becomes too predictable, then it's boring. And if it becomes too complex and you can no longer make any predictions, it's also boring because it seems random to you.
There were two parallel studies to our study that are happening in the country. We always compare results. We often give conferences together to just bring our results together, and just we studied a group of 75 children and they have another 100 and the other group has another 50. So it's always nice to see on a larger scale. So one of these studies is actually at UC San Diego and the Youth Orchestra of San Diego. They actually started around the same time that we started. So they're also in their year 4, and they are comparing children in music training with typically developing children who do not have any training, and also children who are engaged in martial art activities. And they have had similar interesting findings to us in terms of the processing of pitch and the development of the auditory system. And then there is another study, I think it ended about 2 years ago at the Northwestern group, Professor Nina Kraus, who also looked at the community music program and impact of that on child development and language and speech perception, that have found similar findings in terms of physiology and also the benefits in the language aspect and learning of languages. There is a lot of work that's been done in adults, looking at adults who have had long-term music training compared to non-musicians. And then there has been some work looking at, let's say, bringing music as an intervention cross-sectionally for a year into a school program, both in children and adolescents, and collecting pre and post training data. And I think the general consensus is there are benefits of music training in the language and cognitive domain. There are benefits in terms of the motor development. And then there are some benefits in the social domain. That is still not clear because I think the cohorts are different, the assessments are different. So there's also a lot of meetings and discussions around standardized measurement. So we all kind of use the same sets of measures so we can compare our results. But it's a growing and exciting field. There is 2 annual conferences, Society for Music Perception and Cognition and Neuromusic, that brings everybody who does this type of work together. So we have an opportunity to discuss and compare results.
I'm sure one of the nice things about the study of music is that everybody's rooting for music, except for the 2% of people that you've identified that it doesn't really do anything for. Most of us would love to hear good things about music and the brain and how we can use music therapeutically and stuff like that. So it's kind of like you got the whole world at your back.
Yeah, well, that's right. And there is, of course, a whole field of music therapy. And increasingly, there's more contact between neuroscientists like myself and people who are actually working in the clinic using, music therapeutically. They used to be sort of 2 separate communities. And I think now there's a lot more interaction between them. And I think it's quite beneficial to have that interaction.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Drs. Robert Zatorre and Assal Habibi for taking the time for those conversations. A little bit different lines of questioning in each of those conversations, but it seemed related enough to make it sort of a giant super episode on music rather than divvy those into separate episodes. Kind of fascinating. I find myself intrigued both looking at the way that the human brain has stuff in common with the animal kingdom and also the places where we really diverge. Music seems to be one of those areas of interesting divergence. I really like the example that Dr. Zatorre gave, analogizing music to fire as a technology that humans students might have sort of stumbled onto, but then sort of culturally took the ball and ran with it. Maybe to the point where even though the capacity for music wasn't something that was selected for originally, once it was something we began practicing, there probably were evolutionary implications. The number of musicians that have gotten laid as a result of being able to play music, I think that is an uncontestable statement. There's certainly some sexual selection going on there, if nothing else. But keeping it on theme, we'll keep some music stuck in your head in this ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So according to researchers who study such things, 90% of people get an earworm stuck in their head as frequently as once a week. An earworm is the non-scientific name for basically a song that gets stuck in your head, which is also known uninspiringly as involuntary musical imagery. And luckily for all of us, there are scientists looking at what makes some songs more likely to become earworms than others. Our intuition is correct that mere exposure and frequency of exposure has something to do with it. If you hear the song on repeat on the radio thousands of times over the course of a few weeks, it's more likely to wind up being puked up by your subconscious at some point. But all songs are not equally likely to do so based on mere exposure. Scientists actually did a large-scale study on this back in 2013. This was looking at data from songs between 2010 and 2013 in a study originally published in The Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. Said the study's lead author, Dr. Kelly Jacobowski, our findings show that you can to some extent predict which songs are going to get stuck in people's heads based on the song's melodic content. The musically sticky songs seem to have quite a fast tempo, along with a common melodic shape and unusual intervals or repetitions, like we can hear in the opening riff of Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple or in the chorus of Bad Romance by Lady Gaga. So when he talks about a common melodic shape there, if that means nothing to you, do not feel alone. But there are a lot of common tonal patterns that you hear in music. For example, one in Western music is that heard in Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, where the first phrase of the song rises in pitch, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and then the second one falls. There's a bunch of different nursery rhymes that follow this same pattern, which is one of the things that makes it easy for young kids to remember. But you can also find the same contour in non-kids music like Moves Like Jagger by Maroon 5, which was one of the winners of the most likely to be an earworm songs that was in this study. In fact, since I know you're curious, let me just give you the list of the songs that were most frequently named as earworms in this 2010 to 2013 period. Bad Romance by Lady Gaga, Can't Get You Out of My Head by Kylie Minogue, Don't Stop Believing by Journey, which is obviously not from that era, the far earlier song, but a song that won't die. Somebody That I Used to Know, Moves Like Jagger, California Girls by Katy Perry, Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, another oldie, and both Alejandro and Poker Face, also by Lady Gaga, who's obviously hugely represented in that list. The way that this research was conducted was by asking 3,000 people for their most frequent earworm tunes, and then comparing these to the tunes that were equally popular as far as how much they were played, how many people were buying them, stuff like that. So basically, they were popularity matched with other songs, but songs that were not named as potential earworms. And then they compared the music and melody features between the earworms and the non-earworms. And the second crucial ingredient that they found in the formula for an earworm song is an unusual interval structure in the song that either makes some unexpected leaps or has more repeated notes than you would expect. Examples they cite are the instrumental riffs of In the Mood by Glenn Miller and my personal preference, My Sharona by The Knack. But I think we'll take you out of here with a little bit of Deep Purple.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, that is it for episode number 159. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. As usual, all the links and everything else associated with this episode can be found up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/159. If you missed last week's episode, in number 158, we were looking at the heritability of intelligence, what intelligence has to do with your biological lineage from your parents. And next week, in episode number 160, I am not sure what we're going to be doing yet. We got a couple different options, but it may be a question for the Magic 8 Ball. I'm facing analysis paralysis at the moment. But rest assured, we will be back here next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same rhythmic, harmonic, and occasionally crescendoing commitment to improving the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.